The smell of ozone mixed with sweet alien flowers filled the air as David Park walked through the corridors of the Galactic Learning Institute. Young beings from dozens of worlds chattered in their native languages, creating a symphony of clicks, chirps, and musical tones that would have overwhelmed most humans. But David had grown used to it over his 3 years teaching here. A small blue creature with 6 legs scurried past him, carrying what looked like crystallized homework in its mandibles. 2 tall, graceful beings with silver skin glided by, their voices creating harmonious melodies as they discussed quantum mathematics. This was normal life at the academy, where the galaxy's brightest young minds came to learn together. David reached his classroom and paused at the doorway. Through the transparent wall, he could see Instructor Vel teaching a group of mixed-species students about galactic history. Vel stood nearly 8 feet tall, her body made of what looked like living crystal that shifted from blue to purple as she moved. Her species, the Quarians, were known throughout the galaxy for their discipline and strict teaching methods. But something was wrong. One of the students, a small furry creature about the size of a human child, was not paying attention. The little Faloran cub had orange and black striped fur and large green eyes that sparkled with mischief. His name was Pip, and David had noticed him causing trouble before. As David watched, Pip knocked over a stack of data tablets with his tail. The tablets clattered to the floor, disrupting Vel's lesson about ancient trade routes. The other students turned to look, some giggling, others looking nervous. Vel's crystal body flashed red for a moment, a sign of anger in her species. "Pip," Vel said in her musical voice that somehow carried authority across species barriers. "Please pick up those tablets and pay attention." Pip looked up at her with those innocent green eyes and shrugged. "They fell by themselves," he said in the common galactic language. His voice was high and sweet like a human child's, but there was something defiant in his tone. David frowned. In his 3 years here, he had never seen a student directly lie to a teacher like that. Most young beings, regardless of species, seemed to have a natural respect for their elders and instructors. But Pip was different. Vel's crystal body shifted to a deeper purple, another sign of frustration. "Pip, I saw you knock them over with your tail. Please be honest and clean up the mess." "I don't want to," Pip said simply, crossing his small arms over his chest. "This lesson is boring anyway. Who cares about old trade routes?" A shocked silence fell over the classroom. David could see the other students looking back and forth between Pip and Vel, unsure of what would happen next. This kind of open defiance was almost unheard of in galactic educational settings. Vel tried several approaches over the next few minutes. She spoke gently, then firmly. She explained the importance of respect and learning. She even tried bribing Pip with extra recreation time. Nothing worked. The little Faloran just sat there with his arms crossed, occasionally making faces at his classmates to make them laugh. David realized this was becoming a serious problem. In human schools, he had dealt with difficult students before, but this was different. Here at the academy, maintaining order across dozens of different species was incredibly complex. Each species had different social structures, different ways of showing respect, different triggers for rebellion. As the lesson continued, David noticed other things that worried him. When Vel turned to write on the holographic board, Pip made exaggerated copies of her movements, mocking the way her crystal limbs moved. A few other students started to giggle more openly. One young Tellan with his blue-spotted skin even tried copying Pip's defiant pose. This was exactly what David had been afraid of. In his studies of group psychology back on Earth, he had learned how quickly rebellion could spread through a classroom. One defiant student could undermine an entire educational environment if not handled properly. After the lesson ended and the students filed out, David approached Vel. Up close, her crystalline features were beautiful but hard to read. Her species didn't have facial expressions the way humans did, but the colors shifting through her body told him she was deeply troubled. "That was a difficult class," David said carefully. He had learned to be diplomatic when discussing problems with alien colleagues. "Pip has been getting worse every day," Vel admitted, her voice carrying harmonics of frustration. "In my culture, young ones show automatic respect to their teachers." "I do not understand this behavior," David nodded thoughtfully. "Every species raises their young differently. Felorans are naturally playful and independent. Maybe traditional discipline methods don't work on them the same way." "But what am I supposed to do?" Vel asked. If I cannot maintain order in my classroom, how can I teach? And if other students start copying Pip's behavior? She didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew that losing control of one student could lead to chaos throughout the entire academy. With so many different species and cultural backgrounds, maintaining a peaceful learning environment required careful balance. David watched through the window as Pip ran down the hallway, his tail held high and his green eyes bright with mischief. The little Faloran clearly had no idea how much trouble he was causing, or how his behavior was affecting everyone around him. "I'll keep an eye on the situation," David told Vel. "Maybe between the two of us, we can figure out a solution." But as he watched Pip disappear around a corner, David had a sinking feeling that this problem was going to get much worse before it got better. In his experience, when one student started openly defying authority, others usually followed. And in a place like the Galactic Learning Institute, with hundreds of young beings from dozens of different worlds, that could lead to complete chaos. The question was, what could anyone do to stop it? 3 days later, Pip's behavior had gotten much worse. David arrived at the academy early in the morning to find Instructor Vel waiting for him in the hallway, her crystal body flickering between worried blue and angry red. "He's starting to influence the others," Vel said without greeting. Her musical voice carried notes of panic that David had never heard before. "Yesterday, during my lesson on galactic mathematics, 5 other students refused to complete their assignments. They said if Pip didn't have to do work, neither did they." David felt his stomach drop. This was exactly what he had been afraid of. He followed Vel to her classroom and peered through the transparent wall. Inside, chaos was already beginning, even though classes hadn't officially started yet. Pip sat in the center of a group of younger students, telling them something that made them all laugh and clap their various appendages. A young Tellan with blue-spotted skin was practicing Pip's defiant arm-crossing pose. 2 small Rigelian twins, who looked like tiny humanoids made of living metal, were copying the way Pip had mocked Vel's movements. "Watch this," Pip was saying to his audience. He stood up and began walking around in an exaggerated way, making his movements jerky and artificial. It was clearly meant to copy how Vel moved, and it was cruel. The other young beings laughed harder. David watched a shy Altarian student, normally one of the quietest beings in the school, suddenly stand up and try to copy Pip's mocking walk. Her butterfly-like wings fluttered with excitement as the group accepted her into their rebellion. "This is spreading faster than I thought it would," David muttered. When classes began, the situation got even worse. Pip had somehow convinced 6 other students to refuse to sit in their assigned seats. Instead, they all crowded around Pip's desk, creating a small zone of chaos in Vel's normally orderly classroom. "Please return to your seats," Vel said in her most authoritative voice. The crystal formations on her head glowed brighter, a sign that she was calling upon her species' natural leadership presence. "Make us," Pip said with a grin that showed his small, sharp teeth. The other students giggled nervously, but none of them moved. David watched as Vel tried every technique she knew. She explained the rules calmly. She offered rewards for good behavior. She even tried the traditional Quarian method of creating harmonious sound patterns that were supposed to encourage obedience. Nothing worked. Worse, David could see that students in other parts of the classroom were starting to pay more attention to Pip's group than to Vel's lesson. The rebellion was becoming more interesting than learning about galactic history. During the break between classes, David walked through the academy's common areas and noticed the problem spreading even further. In the cafeteria, a group of young beings from different species were sitting together, all refusing to eat the nutritious meals provided by the school. They claimed they wanted to eat whatever they wanted, like Pip does. In the recreation area, several students had decided they didn't want to follow the safety rules for the anti-gravity play zone. They had seen Pip ignore rules in the classroom, so why should they follow rules anywhere else? The worst part was in the library. A young Vegan, normally one of the most studious species in the galaxy, was refusing to check out educational materials. Instead, he wanted only entertainment videos, claiming that learning is stupid, a phrase that sounded very much like something Pip would say. David found himself growing worried about the Academy's entire educational mission. The Galactic Learning Institute had been created as a place where young beings from all over the galaxy could learn to work together, share knowledge, and build the foundation for peaceful cooperation between worlds. But if students started rejecting the very idea of learning and respecting authority, the whole system could collapse. That afternoon, things reached a new level of chaos. During Vel's lesson on important galactic laws, Pip stood up in the middle of class and announced that he was bored. Without asking permission, he simply walked out of the classroom. 2 other students immediately stood up to follow him. Then 3 more. Soon, nearly half the class was walking out, leaving Vel standing alone at the front of the room with only a handful of confused and frightened students remaining. David, who had been observing from the hallway, watched as Pip led his growing group of followers to the Academy's central courtyard. There, under the artificial sky that showed a peaceful blend of different world sunsets, Pip began what could only be called a protest. "Why should we have to learn boring stuff?" Pip called out, his high voice carrying across the courtyard. "Why should we have to listen to teachers who don't understand us? Why can't we just do whatever we want?" Other students throughout the academy heard the commotion and came to watch. Some looked worried, but others seemed excited by Pip's words. A few even joined the protest, adding their own complaints about homework, bedtimes, and healthy meals. David realized that this had moved far beyond a simple classroom discipline problem. Pip had somehow become a leader of a student rebellion that was threatening the very foundation of the academy. And the worst part was that David could see the appeal of what Pip was saying. Rules and structure could feel restrictive, especially to young minds that naturally wanted freedom and fun. But David also knew what adults across the galaxy understood. Without some structure, without respect for authority and knowledge, civilization itself couldn't function. If these young beings grew up thinking they could ignore any rule they didn't like, reject any knowledge that seemed boring, and disrespect anyone who tried to guide them, what kind of galaxy would they create? As he watched Pip rally more and more students to his cause, David realized that someone needed to do something soon. But what? Traditional disciplinary methods clearly weren't working, and with each passing hour, Pip's influence was growing stronger. The little Faloran cub had no idea that his simple desire to avoid boring lessons was turning into something that could affect the future of galactic education itself. By the end of the week, the Galactic Learning Institute was in complete chaos. David walked through corridors filled with the sounds of arguments, crying, and general disorder. What had started as one defiant Faloran cub had grown into something that threatened the entire academy. In the mathematics wing, Instructor Zeph, a tall being with purple skin and multiple arms, stood helplessly as half his students refused to solve basic equations. "Numbers are stupid," one young Rigelian declared, clearly copying Pip's attitude. "Why do we need to know this stuff anyway?" The language arts section was even worse. Students from 12 different worlds sat in sullen silence, refusing to practice speaking in the common galactic tongue. They claimed that if Pip could say whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, then they should be able to communicate however they pleased. David found the academy's headmaster, Director Nara, in her office surrounded by concerned parents from various worlds. Through the translator devices, he could hear complaints in dozens of different languages. Apparently, the rebellion had spread so far that students were taking their new attitudes home. "My daughter refuses to eat traditional Altarian foods," one parent was saying, her butterfly wings fluttering with distress. "She says a furry creature at school told her she only has to eat what she wants. My son won't practice his meditation," another parent added. This one was a tall, peaceful being from Centauri Prime. He claims that learning self-control is boring and dumb, words he definitely did not learn from our culture. Director Nara, a wise old being whose species resembled walking trees, looked more worried than David had ever seen her. Her bark-like skin had taken on a grayish color that indicated extreme stress. "We're receiving complaints from 17 different worlds," she told David when the parents had left. "Some families are threatening to remove their children from the academy. If word spreads that we can't maintain basic order..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. The Galactic Learning Institute was funded by contributions from hundreds of worlds. If parents lost faith in the school's ability to educate their children, the entire program could collapse. David made his way to the central courtyard, where Pip's daily protests had become a regular event. What he saw there made his heart sink. Nearly 200 young beings from dozens of different species were gathered around the little Faloran, cheering as he stood on a makeshift platform made of stacked chairs. "Why should we study history?" Pip was saying. his green eyes bright with excitement at having such a large audience. Dead people did boring stuff a long time ago. Who cares? The crowd cheered. David watched as students who had once been eager learners now shouted agreement with Pip's anti-education message. Why should we follow bedtimes? Pip continued. I stay up as late as I want. Why should we eat healthy food? I eat dessert for breakfast. More cheers. David noticed that many of the students looked tired and slightly sick. Apparently they had been following Pip's advice about staying up late and eating poorly. And why should we listen to teachers who don't understand us? Pip's voice rose to a shout. They're not our species. They don't know what's best for us. This last statement worried David the most. The whole point of the Galactic Learning Institute was to prove that different species could learn from each other. If students started believing they could only be taught by their own kind, it would set back interspecies cooperation by centuries. As the protest continued, David noticed something else troubling. The different species of students were starting to group together by their own kind. The Tellan students stood in one cluster, whispering among themselves in their native language. The Rigelian twins had found several other metallic beings and were creating their own subgroup. The peaceful Altarians huddled together, looking frightened by all the noise and chaos. Pip's rebellion wasn't just creating disorder, it was creating division. Students who had been learning to work together across species lines were now retreating into comfortable groups of their own kind. David watched as two students got into an argument that turned physical. A young Vegan accused a Tellan student of being too aggressive, while the Tellan responded that Vegas were weak and stupid. These were children who had been friends just a week ago, before Pip's influence started spreading. Several teachers tried to break up the fight, but their authority had been so undermined by the ongoing rebellion that the students simply ignored them. David had to step in himself, using his larger size to separate the fighting youngsters. Later that day, the situation reached a new low. During what should have been a peaceful mealtime, food fights broke out in 3 different cafeterias. Students claimed they were following Pip's example of doing whatever we want. Nutritious meals were wasted as young beings threw them around like toys. The medical wing reported an increase in stomach aches and exhaustion as students followed Pip's advice about diet and sleep. The maintenance staff complained that common areas were being destroyed by students who no longer respected academy property. Most seriously, several students had tried to leave the academy grounds without permission, claiming they didn't have to follow safety rules anymore. Only quick action by security staff had prevented young beings from wandering into dangerous areas of the space station. That evening, David attended an emergency meeting of all the academy's instructors. Representatives from dozens of different species filled the conference room, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of worried sounds. Traditional discipline methods are failing completely, reported Instructor Vel, her crystal body now a constant anxious blue. Pip has somehow convinced the students that following rules is a form of weakness. It's worse than that, added Instructor Zeph. The students are losing respect for knowledge itself. They're starting to believe that learning is unnecessary. Director Nara stood at the front of the room, her tree-like form swaying slightly as she considered their options. We could contact the families and ask them to remove the most disruptive students, she said slowly. But that would mean admitting failure. And if Pip goes back to his homeworld spreading these ideas... The room fell silent as everyone considered the implications. If the Academy's first major discipline crisis ended with them simply giving up and sending problem students home, it would prove that different species couldn't successfully educate each other. The dream of galactic educational cooperation would die. There has to be another way, David said quietly. All the alien instructors turned to look at him, their various forms of eyes focusing on the only human in the room. But as he looked back at their worried faces, David realized he had no idea what that other way might be. Everything they had tried had failed, and with each passing day, Pip's influence grew stronger while their authority grew weaker. The question was no longer just how to discipline one defiant student. The question was how to save the entire concept of interspecies education before it collapsed completely. The next morning brought the worst chaos yet. David arrived at the academy to find Instructor Vel's classroom in complete uproar. Pip stood on his desk, tail swishing as he conducted what could only be called a symphony of destruction. Students were throwing their learning tablets, tearing up assignment sheets, and chanting something that sounded like "no more school." "No more rules!" Vel stood at the front of the room, her crystal body flickering rapidly between colors that David had never seen before. She was clearly at the end of her abilities to handle the situation. 3 other instructors had come to help, but their presence had only made things worse. The students saw multiple authority figures as a sign that their rebellion was working. "This is ridiculous," Pip shouted over the noise, his high voice carrying clearly across the chaos. "Why should we pretend to respect teachers who can't even control their own classrooms?" The other students cheered and threw more materials around the room. David noticed that even the normally peaceful Altarian student was participating, her delicate butterfly wings fluttering as she giggled and knocked over a stack of books. "Teachers are useless," Pip continued, clearly enjoying being the center of attention. "They just want to fill our heads with boring information we'll never need. We're better off without them." At this point, several students started demanding to leave the classroom entirely. A few even began walking toward the door, completely ignoring the frantic requests from the teachers to stay seated. David had been watching from the hallway, taking notes on the group dynamics and trying to understand how the situation had spiraled so completely out of control. But as he watched Pip rally the students toward what looked like a complete breakdown of the educational system, something inside him shifted. Without really thinking about it, David walked into the classroom. He didn't announce himself. He didn't shout or wave his arms. He simply walked calmly through the chaos, stepping around thrown tablets and torn papers, until he reached the center of the room where Pip stood on his desk. The noise continued for a moment, but then something strange happened. One by one, the students began to notice David's presence, not because he was demanding attention, but because there was something different about the way he moved through their chaos. He seemed completely unaffected by the noise and destruction around him. David stopped directly in front of Pip's desk and looked up at the little Faloran cub. Pip was still mid-sentence, saying something about how teachers didn't understand students, when he suddenly noticed David standing there. For a moment, the two of them just looked at each other. David's expression was calm but serious, not angry, not threatening, but somehow carrying a weight that made Pip's words trail off into silence. The entire classroom gradually fell quiet as all the other students turned to watch this unexpected confrontation. Even the other teachers stopped their frantic attempts to restore order and simply observed. David didn't raise his voice. He didn't use any threatening gestures. He simply looked directly into Pip's bright green eyes and said one word: "Apologize." The effect was immediate and startling. Pip, who had been defying authority figures for over a week, who had rallied hundreds of students to his cause, who had brought the entire academy to the brink of collapse, suddenly looked like exactly what he was: a small, misbehaving child who had been caught doing something wrong. His ears flattened against his furry head. His tail stopped swishing and drooped toward the floor. Most remarkably, his bright, defiant expression crumbled into something that looked almost like shame. Pip started to say something, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. David waited. He didn't repeat his command or explain what he meant. He simply stood there with that calm, serious expression, as if he knew beyond any doubt that Pip would do the right thing. The silence in the classroom was complete. David could hear the soft humming of the air circulation system, the distant sounds of other classes continuing their lessons, even the gentle crystalline chimes that Vel's body made when she was very still. Finally, Pip climbed down from his desk. His movements were slow and careful, completely different from the bold, theatrical gestures he had been making just moments before. When he reached the floor, he walked over to where Instructor Vel stood. "I'm sorry," Pip said in a small voice that was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry for being mean to you. I'm sorry for making fun of how you move. I'm sorry for telling other students to disobey you." Vel's crystal body shifted to a warm, surprised yellow. "Pip," she said gently, "I accept your apology." But Pip wasn't finished. He turned to address his classmates, who were all watching with wide, startled eyes. "I'm sorry to all of you, too," he said, his voice getting stronger. "I was wrong to tell you that learning was stupid. I was wrong to say you shouldn't listen to your teachers. I was being a bad friend." David watched as something remarkable happened throughout the classroom. The other students, who had been caught up in Pip's rebellion, suddenly seemed to remember who they really were. The shy Altarian student began picking up the books she had knocked over. The young Tellan started gathering scattered tablets. Even the metallic Rigelian twins began organizing torn papers. "We're sorry too," said one of the students. Others began adding their own apologies, creating a chorus of remorse that seemed to wash away the chaos of the past week. David nodded once, satisfied with what he saw, and then quietly walked toward the classroom exit. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back at Pip one more time. "Good," he said simply, and then he was gone. Behind him, the classroom buzzed with quiet activity as students worked together to clean up the mess they had made. Instructor Vel began a gentle lesson about respect and responsibility, and for the first time in over a week, every student listened carefully. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the academy. David spent the rest of the day fielding questions from amazed colleagues who couldn't understand how he had accomplished what all their traditional methods had failed to achieve. But David himself was still puzzling over what had happened. He had acted purely on instinct, drawing on something deep in his understanding of human social dynamics. Somehow he had managed to reach past all the species differences and cultural barriers to touch something universal in that young being's conscience. The question now was whether this unexpected success was just a temporary fix, or if it represented something more profound about human understanding of social harmony. Within hours of David's intervention, the entire academy was buzzing with curiosity and amazement. Director Nara called an emergency assembly where she announced that the student rebellion had ended, but she didn't explain how. The mystery of what the human teacher had done spread through both student and faculty populations like wildfire. David found himself constantly surrounded by alien colleagues asking questions he wasn't sure how to answer. Instructor Vel approached him during the afternoon break, her crystal body shimmering with colors that indicated deep curiosity. "I must understand what you did," she said, her musical voice carrying harmonics of wonder. "In all my years of teaching, I have never seen such an immediate transformation. What method did you use? What technique from your species' educational practices?" David sat down heavily in the faculty lounge, feeling overwhelmed by the attention. "I honestly don't know if I can explain it," he said. "I didn't use any specific technique. I just did what felt right." "But that's exactly what we need to understand," said Instructor Zeph, joining the conversation. His purple skin was flushed darker with excitement. "My species has studied behavioral control for thousands of years. We have precise methods for encouraging obedience through logical reasoning and reward systems. But what you did was something completely different." More teachers gathered around as word spread that David was discussing his intervention. Soon the lounge was filled with beings from dozens of different worlds, all trying to understand how one human had solved a problem that had baffled their combined expertise. "When I looked at Pip," David said slowly, trying to put his instincts into words, "I didn't see a rebellious student who needed to be controlled. I saw a child who had forgotten how to feel ashamed of hurting others." The alien teachers looked puzzled. "Shame?" asked a tall, thin instructor whose species resembled walking plants. "You mean the emotional response to social disapproval?" "More than that," David explained. "In human societies, shame isn't just about being caught doing something wrong. It's about recognizing that your actions have hurt people you should care about. When I told Pip to apologize, I wasn't threatening him with punishment. I was reminding him that he had a moral responsibility to the people around him." "But how did you know this would work across species barriers?" Vel asked. "Fellerans don't have the same social structures as humans. Their family groups operate on completely different principles." David considered this carefully. "I think there might be something universal about the feeling of disappointing someone who expects better from you. When I said apologize, I wasn't speaking as an authority figure demanding obedience. I was speaking as someone who believed Pip was capable of being better than he was acting." This seemed to confuse the alien teachers even more. On most worlds, authority worked through clear hierarchies. Leaders gave orders and followers obeyed out of respect for position or fear of consequences. The idea that you could influence behavior through moral expectation rather than institutional power was foreign to many of their cultures. "Let me give you an example," David said, warming to the topic. "On Earth, human children often misbehave. But the most effective parents aren't the ones who punish the hardest or shout the loudest. They're the ones who make their children want to be better people. How? Asked several teachers at once. By showing that they believe in the child's ability to make good choices, David explained. When a human parent says, "I'm disappointed in you," it's often more powerful than any punishment, because it means the child has failed to live up to expectations that came from love and trust. Director Nara, who had been listening quietly from the edge of the group, stepped forward. Her bark-like skin showed the deep green color that indicated intense thought. "You're suggesting that moral authority is more powerful than institutional authority," she said slowly. "That beings will change their behavior more readily for someone who appeals to their conscience than for someone who threatens consequences." "In many cases, yes," David nodded. "But it only works if the person truly believes you care about them and want them to succeed. If Pip had thought I was just another authority figure trying to control him, he would have ignored me like he ignored everyone else." "But why did he believe you cared?" Vel asked. "You barely knew him." David thought about this for a long moment. "I think it was because I approached him as an individual, not as a problem to be solved. When I looked at him, I saw potential, not just misbehavior, and somehow he sensed that." The conversation continued for hours as David tried to explain concepts that felt natural to him, but were revolutionary to his alien colleagues. He talked about human ideas of empathy, moral development, and the complex social emotions that helped human societies function. On Earth, he explained, we learned that the most stable communities aren't held together by rules and punishments. They're held together by shared values and mutual respect. Children learn to behave well not because they're afraid of consequences, but because they want to be valued members of their community. "This is fascinating," said Instructor Zeph. "My species controls behavior through precise logical frameworks. We show young ones exactly why certain actions are inefficient or harmful, and they choose better behaviors based on rational analysis. And my people use harmonic resonance," added Vel. "We create sound patterns that naturally encourage cooperation and peace." "Both of those methods probably work well for your species," David said. "But humans develop something different. We learn to use emotional connection and moral expectation as tools for social harmony." As the discussion wound down, David realized that his colleagues weren't just curious about his methods, they were excited about the possibilities. If human approaches to social management could work across species barriers, it might revolutionize education throughout the galaxy. "Would you be willing to teach us these techniques?" Director Nara asked. "Perhaps we could develop a training program for instructors from all species." David felt both honored and nervous. "I can try," he said. "But I'm not sure how much of this can be taught. A lot of it comes from instincts that humans develop naturally through millions of years of social evolution." "Then perhaps," said Vel thoughtfully, "we need to learn not just your techniques but your way of thinking about relationships between individuals." As the meeting ended and the alien teachers dispersed to their evening duties, David remained in the lounge thinking about what had happened. He had solved the immediate crisis with Pip, but the real impact might be much larger. For the first time, the galaxy was discovering that humans had something unique to offer in the realm of social harmony and moral education. The question was, could these very human concepts really work on a galactic scale? 6 months later, David stood in the same classroom where the crisis had reached its peak, but everything had changed. Pip sat in the front row, eagerly raising his hand to answer questions about galactic mathematics. The other students who had once followed his rebellion were now some of the Academy's most engaged learners, but the transformation went far beyond one classroom. Word of the human teacher's intervention had spread throughout the galaxy faster than anyone had expected. Educational institutions on dozens of worlds had requested detailed reports about the incident. Some had even asked for human consultants to visit their schools. "The requests keep coming in," Director Nara told David as they walked through the Academy's halls during the morning break. "Just yesterday, I received inquiries from the advanced learning centers of 3 different star systems. They all want to understand what you call moral authority teaching methods." David watched as students from various species worked together on group projects, sharing knowledge and helping each other solve problems. The sight never failed to amaze him. After the rebellion, the Academy had not only returned to normal but had become more harmonious than ever before. How is Pip doing in his other classes? David asked. Excellently, Nara replied, her bark-like skin showing the warm brown color that indicated satisfaction. But more importantly, he's become a leader in positive ways. When new students arrive and seem confused or homesick, Pip is often the first to help them adjust. They paused outside Instructor Vel's classroom, where she was teaching a lesson about interspecies cooperation. Through the transparent wall, David could see Pip helping a nervous new student from a species he had never seen before, a small being that looked like it was made of flowing water. I still don't understand exactly what you did, Vel had told David just last week, but I've been trying to apply your principles. Instead of demanding obedience, I try to show students that I believe in their ability to make good choices. The results had been remarkable. Vel's classes were now among the most successful in the academy, with students who seemed genuinely excited about learning. Other instructors had begun asking her for advice, creating a ripple effect of improved teaching throughout the school. But the real proof of the method's success was happening on a much larger scale. David had been invited to speak at educational conferences on 7 different worlds. Each time he had tried to explain the human concepts of empathy, moral development, and social conscience to audiences of alien educators. The responses had been mixed but encouraging. Some species found the ideas completely foreign to their way of thinking, but others had embraced the concepts and begun experimenting with them in their own schools. The most interesting results are coming from worlds with multiple species, David told Nara as they continued their walk. Places where different types of beings have to learn to live together. The human approach seems especially effective in those environments. They reached the Academy's central courtyard, where the same area that had once hosted Pip's rebellious protest now served as a peaceful study space. Students from dozens of worlds sat together under the artificial sky, working on assignments and helping each other understand difficult concepts. I received a communication from the Educational Council of the Rigel system, Nara said. They've implemented what they're calling human-style social harmony protocols in all their schools. Behavioral problems have decreased by 70% in just 4 months. David felt a mixture of pride and responsibility. It was gratifying to know that human approaches to social management were helping young beings across the galaxy. But it was also overwhelming to think that millions of students might be affected by concepts he had developed through pure instinct. There's something else, Nara continued. The Galactic Education Authority wants to establish a new department focused on interspecies social dynamics. They've asked if you would be willing to head it. David stopped walking and stared at her. The Galactic Education Authority was the highest educational body in known space, responsible for setting standards that affected billions of students across thousands of worlds. They want me to what? Lead a team of researchers and teachers from various species to develop curricula based on human social management principles, Nara explained. The goal would be to create educational approaches that work effectively for mixed species populations. As they talked, Pip appeared from around a corner, his orange and black fur gleaming in the artificial sunlight. He was carrying a data tablet and had 3 other students with him, beings from different worlds who had clearly become his friends. Instructor David, Pip called out, his green eyes bright with excitement. Look what we discovered. The group approached and Pip held up his tablet, which showed a complex mathematical proof. We were working on the assignment about quantum calculations, and Vera here, he gestured to the water-like being, showed us a way to solve it that none of us had thought of. It only worked because we all approached it differently. David smiled as he looked at the diverse group of young scholars. This was exactly what the Academy had been designed to achieve. Students from different worlds learning that their differences made them stronger together. That's excellent work, David told them. You're discovering that the best solutions often come from combining different perspectives. As the students hurried off to share their discovery with Instructor Vel, David realized that this was the real success of the human approach. It wasn't just about maintaining order or preventing rebellions. It was about creating environments where different types of beings felt valued and respected for who they were. So what do you think? Nara asked. About the position with the Galactic Education Authority? David looked around the courtyard one more time, taking in the sight of dozens of young beings from across the galaxy, learning and playing together in harmony. 6 months ago, this same space had been filled with chaos and division. Now it represented the best hope for peaceful cooperation between worlds, I think, David said slowly, that humans might have more to offer the galaxy than we ever realized. 3 years later, the human model of education had been implemented in schools across 200 star systems. Behavioral problems in mixed-species environments had decreased dramatically, while academic achievement and interspecies cooperation had reached levels that previous generations had thought impossible. Pip, now a teenage Faloran, had become the Academy's first student ambassador to other worlds. He traveled to new schools to help them implement the social harmony protocols, sharing his own story of transformation from rebel to leader. And David Park, the human teacher who had once solved a classroom crisis with a single word, found himself at the center of an educational revolution that was changing the way the galaxy thought about authority, respect, and the power of believing in someone's, potential to be better. The incident that had started with one defiant cub refusing to follow rules had grown into proof that humans possessed something the galaxy desperately needed: the ability to touch the conscience of any being, regardless of species, and inspire them to become their best selves. It was, many agreed, humanity's greatest gift to the stars.